Behind every true crime story lies a shattered world, families forever changed, communities left searching for answers, and lives cut tragically short. While we've carefully researched and respectfully crafted this account, what follows is not entertainment. It's a real story of loss, pain, and the darkness that sometimes dwells in human hearts. Our mission is to illuminate these shadows not for spectacle, but to honor those whose voices were silenced, and perhaps, to help prevent future tragedies through understanding. This video contains detailed accounts of violence that some viewers may find disturbing. If you choose to continue, you're not just watching a story, you're bearing witness to events that forever altered real lives. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. At 12:33 in the morning on January 7, 2007, Deanna Christian's phone rang. She grabbed it immediately. Finally. Her daughter Shannon had promised to call, promised to be home soon, and this had to be her. Hello. Deanna's voice carried equal parts relief and concern. Mom, it's me. I'll be back between 2 and 3 a.m. Shannon's voice sounded steady, almost normal, but something felt wrong. Deanna couldn't put her finger on it, just a mother's instinct screaming beneath the surface of an ordinary sentence. Okay honey, we'll see you soon. Be careful. I will, Mom. Love you. The line went dead. Deanna stood in her kitchen holding the phone, staring at it like it might offer some explanation for the unease crawling up her spine. Her daughter's voice had been calm, measured, but too measured. Like someone reading lines. Like someone being watched. At that exact moment, 3 miles away in a rental house on Chipman Street in North Knoxville, Shannon Gale Christian was fighting for her life. The phone call her mother just received? It was a lie. A cruel deception forced upon a 21-year-old college senior who knew with absolute certainty that she would never see her parents again. If you're watching from anywhere in the world right now, drop your location in the comments. This story needs to be heard everywhere because what happened to Shannon and her boyfriend Christopher Newsom over the next 48 hours would become one of the most brutal crimes in American history. And it almost got swept under the rug. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't just another true crime story. This is about two real people with real dreams who had their futures violently stolen. This is about families who spent 12 years fighting a broken system for justice. And this is about how their deaths changed laws that now protect victims across an entire state. So here's what I'm asking. If this story impacts you, if it makes you feel something, hit that subscribe button right now. Not for me. For Shannon and Chris. Because the more people who hear their names, the more their legacy lives on. Let's rewind. 48 hours before that midnight phone call. 48 hours before unimaginable horror. Back when Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom were just two young people in love planning an ordinary Saturday night. Shannon was born April 29, 1985 in Nacogdoches, Texas. When she turned 12, her family relocated to Tennessee, settling into Knoxville's quiet suburbs where she would spend her teenage years becoming the kind of person everyone wanted to be around. At Farragut High School, she wasn't just popular, she was magnetic. Teachers remembered her smile lighting up classrooms before she even spoke. Friends described someone who could walk into any room and make everyone feel like they mattered. She had this rare quality, this genuine warmth that made people feel seen. But Shannon wasn't just a pretty face with a winning personality. She was brilliant and driven with plans that extended far beyond herself. By January 2007, she was weeks away from graduating from the University of Tennessee with a degree in sociology. Not because it was easy, but because she wanted to make a real difference. Shannon had plans to work with underserved communities, to help people who needed it most. She saw problems in the world and genuinely believed she could fix them. Her parents, Gary and Deanna Christian, watched their daughter with the kind of pride that makes your chest ache. Here was this young woman who played competitive golf, excelled academically, and still found time to care deeply about everyone around her. She was their miracle, their proof that good people still existed in a world that often felt dark. Christopher Newsom was Knoxville through and through. Born September 21, 1983, he embodied everything good about small-town American values. Hard work, loyalty, showing up when you said you would. At Halls High School, Chris was a baseball star, not because he was the biggest or the strongest, but because he had heart. His teammates remembered a guy who played every game like it mattered, who lifted others up instead of tearing them down, who never let ego interfere with teamwork. After graduation, while other kids chased big dreams in distant cities, Chris stayed home. He enrolled at Pellissippi State Community College, learned carpentry, and became exceptional at it. If you drive through Knox County today, you'll still see Christopher Newsom's handiwork. Crown molding in homes across the area, crafted by hands that would never hold a hammer again. Each piece a testament to a young man who took pride in building things that would last. At 23, Chris was building more than houses. He was building a life with Shannon Christian. Friends said they were perfect together. She was the fire, he was the steady flame. She dreamed big, he made those dreams feel possible. They balanced each other in that rare way that makes people believe in soulmates. Chris was the kind of guy who texted back immediately, who showed up when he said he would, who never left people wondering where he was or if he was okay. That last part? That's what made Saturday night, January 6, 2007 so terrifying for everyone who knew him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that Saturday afternoon when everything was still normal. When two young people had no idea they were living their final hours of freedom. Shannon spent the afternoon at her friend's apartment on Washington Pike in North Knoxville. She was getting ready the way she always did, taking her time, making sure everything was perfect. Friends remembered her being in a great mood that day, excited about the evening ahead. She and Chris had simple plans. Dinner, maybe catch a movie, then head to a friend's party. Nothing special, nothing dangerous. Just another Saturday night for a young couple in love. Around 8 p.m., Chris pulled up in his truck to pick her up. Security cameras captured what happened next, though at the time, absolutely nobody was paying attention to the ordinary scene playing out in an ordinary apartment complex parking lot. Shannon walked out to meet him. They embraced in that unconscious way people do when they're genuinely happy to see each other. A simple, sweet moment between two people who loved each other. The kind of moment that happens 1,000 times a day in parking lots across the world. Except this time someone was watching. From somewhere in the shadows of that parking lot, predators had spotted their prey. 5 killers who had been driving around that Saturday night looking for victims, looking for someone to hurt, someone to destroy, someone whose suffering would entertain them. Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom had just become perfect targets. Not because they did anything wrong. Not because they were in the wrong place. But because evil doesn't need a reason. It just needs an opportunity. And they had just provided one. What happened next took less than 5 minutes. That's all it takes for your entire life to change. 5 minutes. At gunpoint, both Shannon and Chris were forced into the backseat of Shannon's own Toyota 4Runner. Their hands were bound behind their backs with shoelaces. Their normal Saturday night, their dinner plans, their friend's party, their future together, all of it ended in the time it takes to microwave popcorn. The 4Runner pulled away from the apartment complex at approximately 9 p.m. Inside were 7 people now. Shannon and Chris as terrified captives, and 5 killers who were already planning unspeakable horrors. 3 miles away at a rental house on Chipman Street, the real nightmare was waiting. Meanwhile, across town, friends were gathering for the party Shannon and Chris were supposed to attend. 9:30 rolled around. Where were they? This wasn't like them to be late without calling. Someone sent a text. No response. Someone tried calling. Straight to voicemail. 10 p.m. Still nothing. The worry started creeping in, that low-level anxiety that something isn't quite right. By 11 p.m., a few friends drove back to the Washington Pike apartment complex where the couple had last been seen. They found Chris's truck still parked exactly where he'd left it hours ago. But Shannon's 4Runner was gone. And so were Shannon and Chris. At midnight, concern turned to genuine fear. Multiple people were now trying to reach them. Dozens of texts. Countless calls. Every single one unanswered. And at 12:33 a.m. on January 7th, Shannon's phone rang in her mother's hand. "I'll be back between 2 and 3 a.m. A lie delivered in a steady voice by a young woman who knew she was already dead. She just didn't know how long the dying would take. At that moment, inside 2316 Chipman Street, Christopher Newsom was being separated from Shannon for the last time. His hands were bound behind his back with shoelaces. A sock was forced into his mouth to muffle his screams. His head was covered with a sweatshirt tied around his neck with more shoelaces, leaving him blind and gasping for air. The forensic evidence that would later emerge in court revealed that Chris was sexually assaulted inside that house. This wasn't just murder. This was torture designed to inflict maximum suffering on another human being for no reason other than the entertainment of monsters. But his killers weren't finished. Not even close. This wasn't like them to be late without calling. Someone sent a text. No response. Someone tried calling. Straight to voicemail. 10 p.m. Still nothing. The worry started creeping in, that low-level anxiety that something isn't quite right. By 11 p.m., a few friends drove back to the Washington Pike apartment complex where the couple had last been seen. They found Chris's truck still parked exactly where he'd left it hours ago. But Shannon's 4Runner was gone. And so were Shannon and Chris. At midnight, concern turned to genuine fear. Multiple people were now trying to reach them. Dozens of texts. Countless calls. Every single one unanswered. And at 12:33 a.m. on January 7th, Shannon's phone rang in her mother's hand. "I'll be back between 2 and 3 a.m. A lie delivered in a steady voice by a young woman who knew she was already dead. She just didn't know how long the dying would take. At that moment, inside 2316 Chipman Street, Christopher Newsom was being separated from Shannon for the last time. His hands were bound behind his back with shoelaces. A sock was forced into his mouth to muffle his screams. His head was covered with a sweatshirt tied around his neck with more shoelaces, leaving him blind and gasping for air. The forensic evidence that would later emerge in court revealed that Chris was sexually assaulted inside that house. This wasn't just murder. This was torture designed to inflict maximum suffering on another human being for no reason other than the entertainment of monsters. But his killers weren't finished. Not even close. Sometime in the early morning hours, Chris was forced to march barefoot from the house. Outside, the Tennessee winter was brutal. Temperatures had dropped below freezing. Chris, wearing only a shirt and underwear, was forced to walk nearly half a mile through the bitter cold to a set of railroad tracks behind the house. His bare feet left bloody prints in the frost. Every step was agony. Every breath burned his lungs. And he knew exactly where this walk was ending. If you're still watching, I need you to do something. Hit the like button right now. Not because this story is easy to hear, but because Shannon and Chris deserve to have their story told. They deserve to be remembered as more than just victims. At the railroad tracks, Christopher Newsom was shot 3 times. The first bullet struck his neck. He survived it. Can you imagine? Knowing you've just been shot and you're still conscious, still aware, still alive. The second bullet hit his back. Still alive. The third and final shot was fired with the gun's muzzle pressed directly against his head just above his right ear. The bullet severed his brain stem instantly. Christopher Newsom died at age 23 on a frozen railroad track, alone, tortured, murdered for absolutely no reason. But even death wasn't enough for these monsters. They wrapped his body in a comforter, doused it with gasoline, and set him on fire. The flames were meant to destroy evidence, to burn away DNA that might link them to his sexual assault. When a railroad worker discovered the charred remains the next afternoon, January 7th, the body was so badly burned that identification required dental records. While Christopher was being murdered, Shannon Christian was beginning a nightmare that would last 2 more days. 2 more days of torture. 2 more days of rape. 2 more days of watching her own death approach in slow motion. And that midnight phone call to her mother? That was made while her boyfriend was being marched to his execution. While she was being held captive in a bedroom, guarded by an 18-year-old girl who would later claim she was just as much a victim. The evidence would tell a very different story. But we're not there yet. Right now, at 12:33 a.m. on January 7th, Deanna Christian is standing in her kitchen holding a phone, trying to shake off the feeling that something is terribly wrong with her daughter's voice. Right now, Gary Christian is lying awake in bed, wondering why Shannon sounded so strange. Right now, Hugh and Mary Newsom are starting to worry because their son Chris hasn't come home and his bed hasn't been slept in. Right now, friends at a party are comparing notes, realizing that nobody has heard from Shannon or Chris in hours. And right now, 3 miles away on Chipman Street, a young woman is praying for death to come quickly while knowing it won't. What happened next would test the limits of human endurance, challenge everything we think we know about evil, and expose critical flaws in a justice system that failed 2 families for over a decade. The worst was yet to come. And when morning arrived, 2 families would begin the longest nightmare of their lives, not knowing that justice would take 12 years, 8 trials, and 2 landmark laws to finally achieve. To understand what happened to Shannon and Chris, you need to know about the monsters who took them. And I use that word carefully. Monsters. Because what you're about to hear goes beyond criminal behavior. This was predatory hunting by 5 people who viewed human beings as nothing more than entertainment. 2316 Chipman Street looked ordinary from the outside. Just another rental house in North Knoxville, the kind of place you drive past without giving it a second thought. Peeling paint, small yard, nothing remarkable. But inside, it was a breeding ground for violence. The house belonged to 25-year-old Latalvis Davidson. Davidson wasn't just a criminal, he was a career predator with a pattern that should have kept him locked away permanently. 5 months earlier, in August 2006, he'd been released from prison after serving 5 years for carjacking and aggravated robbery. 5 years for violently attacking innocent people and stealing their property. And within months of release, he was back to his old ways, dealing drugs and planning violent crimes from his Chipman Street base. Think about that for a second. 5 months. That's all it took for the system to release a violent offender who immediately returned to victimizing others. 5 months between prison release and participating in one of Tennessee's most brutal murders. If that doesn't make you angry, I don't know what will. Drop a comment right now telling me what you think about violent offenders being released early. Because this conversation matters. Davidson didn't work alone. His half-brother, Lamarcus Cobbins, was 24 years old with his own history of robbery convictions. The two brothers fed off each other's violence, each one pushing the other to new depths of depravity. That's how it works with people like this. Alone they're dangerous. Together they're unstoppable. Then there was George Thomas, 24 years old, known on the streets as Detroit. Thomas had multiple felony convictions and a reputation for brutality that made even hardened criminals nervous. When your own criminal associates are afraid of you, that tells you something about the level of violence you're capable of. Eric Dwayne Boyd was the oldest of the group at 34. Another career criminal with a string of violent offenses stretching back years. Boyd had spent more of his adult life inside prison than outside it, and every time he got released he went right back to hurting people. For men. 4 violent predators with decades of combined criminal history. For people who had spent their entire adult lives victimizing innocent people. And on January 6, 2007, they were all gathered together in one place like a pack of rabid animals. But the group had a 5th member. Someone who would prove that evil doesn't discriminate by gender. Vanessa Coleman was 18 years old. Just 18. Cobbins' girlfriend. To the outside world, she might have seemed like just another teenager caught up with the wrong crowd, maybe a victim herself of these violent men. But what Coleman would do over the next 48 hours would prove she was every bit as monstrous as the men she ran with. Sometimes the cruelest people are the ones you least suspect. On Saturday, January 6th, these 5 predators made a decision that would seal the fate of 2 innocent people. They were going to go hunting. That's literally what they called it. Hunting. Looking for victims to rob, rape, and terrorize. They had no specific plan, no particular target in mind. They were just cruising the streets of Knoxville in the early evening hours, windows down despite the cold, scanning parking lots and side streets for opportunities. For prey. At approximately 7:30 p.m., their hunting ground became the Washington Pike apartment complex. It was perfect for what they had in mind. Multiple buildings, lots of cars coming and going, plenty of shadows to hide in. They circled the parking lot slowly, watching, waiting, looking for someone vulnerable. Then they saw her. A young woman, petite, alone, walking across the parking lot toward a vehicle. But she wasn't alone for long. A young man got out of a truck to greet her. They embraced. Clearly a couple. Clearly in love. To Davidson, Cobbins, Thomas, Boyd, and Coleman, Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom weren't human beings. They were targets. Within minutes, guns were drawn. Within minutes, 2 young people's lives changed forever. But here's what you need to understand about predators like this. They don't just wake up one day and commit murder. There's always a history. Always a pattern. Always warning signs that society either missed or ignored. Let's talk about Latalvis Davidson's history because it's important. In 2001, at age 19, Davidson and an accomplice carjacked a young couple at gunpoint in Knoxville. They forced the victims to drive to an ATM and withdraw money. Then they robbed them of everything they had and left them stranded. Sound familiar? It should. Because that's almost exactly what happened to Shannon and Chris 6 years later. Davidson was caught, convicted, and sentenced to prison. But here's the thing, he only served 5 years of his sentence before being released on good behavior. Good behavior. This is a man who terrorized innocent people at gunpoint, and the system decided he'd behaved well enough to deserve early release. So in August 2006, Davidson walked out of prison and straight back into society with no meaningful supervision, no real rehabilitation, and absolutely no remorse for what he'd done. Within weeks, he was dealing drugs out of his Chipman Street rental. Within months, he was planning new crimes. And on January 6, 2007, he was hunting new victims. The system failed. And Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom paid the price for that failure with their lives. Lamarcus Cobbins had a similar history. Multiple robbery convictions. Multiple prison sentences. Multiple releases followed by immediate returns to criminal behavior. He and Davidson together were a disaster waiting to happen. George Thomas? Same story. Violent crimes, prison time, release, more violent crimes. Eric Boyd? Career criminal who'd spent most of his adult life behind bars. And Vanessa Coleman? 18 years old with no significant criminal history, which makes what she did even more chilling. Because she had choices. She wasn't a hardened criminal when this started. She made a conscious decision to participate in torture and murder. If you're wondering why I'm spending so much time on the killer's backgrounds, here's why. Because we need to understand how this happened. We need to understand how 5 predators ended up in the same place at the same time with access to weapons and victims. We need to understand the systemic failures that allowed violent offenders to be released early and reoffend. Hit subscribe right now if you think violent criminals should serve their full sentences. Because this isn't just about Shannon and Chris. This is about every victim of repeat offenders. This is about a justice system that values prison space over public safety. Let's get back to Saturday night. Around 8 p.m., Davidson, Cobbins, and Boyd were in one vehicle slowly circling the Washington Pike apartment complex. Thomas and Coleman were waiting back at the Chipman Street house, preparing for whatever victims the others brought back. And yes, you heard that right. They were preparing. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity that got out of hand. This was planned. They knew what they were going to do before they ever saw Shannon and Chris. The security cameras at the Washington Pike complex captured the final moments of freedom for 2 young people who had no idea they were being watched. 8:15 p.m. Shannon emerges from her friend's apartment building. She's wearing jeans and a comfortable sweater, dressed for a casual night out. Her long blonde hair is pulled back. She's smiling as she walks across the dimly lit parking lot toward Chris's truck. Chris sees her coming and gets out to greet her. They share what witnesses would later describe as a tender embrace between 2 people clearly in love. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, they stand there talking, deciding whether to take his truck or her 4Runner to their next destination. They choose the 4Runner. It's newer, more comfortable, better for driving around on a cold January night. Shannon gets in the driver's seat. Chris walks around to the passenger side. Neither of them notices the car that's been slowly circling the parking lot for the past 20 minutes. Neither sees the faces pressed against the windows, watching their every move, calculating, planning. To Shannon and Chris, this is just another Saturday night. But to the killers stalking them, they've just become perfect victims. 8:20 p.m. Shannon and Chris are sitting in the 4Runner, still in the parking lot, probably checking phones or deciding where to go for dinner. That's when Davidson's vehicle pulls up alongside them. Boyd gets out first. He's holding a gun. Within seconds, the passenger door of Shannon's 4Runner is jerked open. Chris has a gun pointed at his face before he can even react. Get out. Get in the back. Now. Shannon starts to scream, but Cobbins is already at her door with another weapon. She has maybe 2 seconds to decide whether to fight, to run, to try something, anything. But when you're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun held by someone who clearly has no problem using it, your options disappear. The entire abduction takes less than 3 minutes. Chris is pulled from the passenger seat, his hands are immediately bound behind his back with shoelaces. Shannon is forced from the driver's seat into the back of her own vehicle. Her hands are tied. Both victims are now in the back seat with guns pointed at their heads while Davidson climbs into the driver's seat of Shannon's 4Runner. Cobbins gets in the front passenger seat. Boyd follows in the other vehicle. They pull away from the apartment complex at 8:23 p.m., heading north toward Chipman Street. Inside the 4Runner, Shannon and Chris are terrified but still holding on to hope. Maybe this is just a robbery. Maybe these men just want the car and whatever money they have. Maybe if they cooperate they'll be let go. That hope would die very soon. The 3-mile drive to Chipman Street was the longest journey of Shannon and Chris's lives. Every second stretched into eternity. Every turn in the road could be taking them closer to death. In the back seat, Chris was trying to stay calm, trying to figure out what these men wanted, trying to calculate whether there would be any chance to escape. Shannon was doing everything she could not to break down crying because she knew showing fear to predators only makes them worse. Davidson drove carefully, obeying all traffic laws, stopping at red lights. The last thing he wanted was to get pulled over with 2 bound hostages in the vehicle. Cobbins kept turning around, making sure the victims stayed quiet and compliant. 8:35 p.m. The 4Runner pulls up outside 2316 Chipman Street. Thomas and Coleman are waiting inside. The door opens. Shannon and Chris are forced into the house at gunpoint. The door closes behind them. And their 48-hour nightmare officially begins. Inside that house, Christopher Newsom was immediately separated from Shannon. That's Predator Behavior 101. Separate your victims so they can't support each other, can't plan together, can't coordinate any kind of resistance. Chris was taken to one room. Shannon to another. And over the next several hours, both would suffer torture so brutal that even seasoned homicide detectives would struggle to maintain their composure while describing it in court years later. But here's something crucial. Even in hell, even facing unimaginable horror, Both Shannon and Chris showed incredible courage. Chris fought. The forensic evidence showed defensive wounds on his body. He didn't go quietly. He made them work for it. And Shannon? According to Davidson's own confession, at some point during her captivity, while being held by 5 people, while suffering torture I can barely describe, she looked at her attackers and said the words that would haunt everyone who heard them. I don't want to die. Think about that. Stripped of everything, surrounded by monsters, in the worst moment of her entire life, Shannon Christian found the courage to speak, to assert her humanity, to look evil in the face and say I matter. I deserve to live. Tell me in the comments if you think you could show that kind of courage. Because I honestly don't know if I could. Her plea fell on deaf ears. These 5 predators weren't interested in mercy. They weren't interested in humanity. They were interested in power and cruelty and sexual gratification and nothing else. Around midnight, Shannon was forced to call her parents. The phone was held to her ear while someone fed her the lines. I'll be back between 2 and 3 a.m. Her voice was steady because she knew if she sounded panicked, her parents would call police immediately. And if police came to the Chipman Street house right then, she and Chris would be killed instantly. So she lied to save time. Time that might lead to a chance to escape. Time that might lead to someone finding them. But deep down, Shannon Christian knew she was never going home. While she was making that phone call, Christopher Newsom was being subjected to sexual assault in another room of the house. The forensic evidence presented at trial was clear. Chris was raped using an object. This wasn't just murder. This was torture designed to humiliate and destroy. And then, sometime around 2 a.m. on January 7th, Eric Boyd decided it was time to finish Chris off. Boyd was the shooter. That fact would take 12 years to prove, but eventually the evidence became undeniable. Boyd forced Christopher Newsom to march barefoot out of the house. Outside, the January cold was brutal. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Chris was wearing only a shirt and underwear. His feet were bare. His hands were bound behind his back. A sock was still stuffed in his mouth. His head was still covered with a sweatshirt tied around his neck. He couldn't see where he was going. He could barely breathe. Every step on the frozen ground sent shooting pain through his feet. And he knew exactly where this march was ending. Half a mile. That's how far Christopher Newsom walked to his execution. Half a mile through freezing darkness, barefoot, bound, blind. And along that route, investigators later found a mangled dog leash, suggesting it was used to control him like an animal during that final walk. At the railroad tracks behind Chipman Street, Eric Boyd raised a .22 caliber revolver. First shot. Chris's neck. The bullet tore through flesh but missed major arteries. He was still alive. Still conscious. Still aware of what was happening. Second shot. Chris's back. The bullet punctured tissue but didn't kill. He was still alive. Third shot. Boyd pressed the gun's muzzle directly against Christopher's head, just above his right ear. This time the bullet severed his brain stem. Death was instantaneous. Christopher Newsom's last conscious thought is something we'll never know. But I hope it was of Shannon. I hope it was of his family. I hope it was of the life he'd built and the future he'd dreamed of. Because he deserved so much more than dying alone on frozen railroad tracks at age 23. Boyd wrapped the body in a comforter, doused it with gasoline and set it on fire. The flames were meant to destroy DNA evidence. And they largely succeeded. When Chris's body was found the next afternoon, it was burned so severely that identification required dental records. Back at the house, Shannon Christian had just heard 3 gunshots in the distance. She knew what they meant. If you're still watching, thank you. Thank you for hearing this story. Thank you for making sure Shannon and Chris aren't forgotten. Hit the like button if this story is affecting you. Because that's how we keep their memory alive. The sun rose on Sunday, January 7, 2007. For most people in Knoxville, it was just another winter morning. Cold, quiet, ordinary. But inside 2316 Chipman Street, Shannon Christian was entering hour 12 of a nightmare that would last another 36 hours. Christopher was dead. Shannon didn't know that for certain, but she knew those gunshots she'd heard in the early morning hours meant something terrible. She was alone now. Completely alone. Surrounded by 5 people who viewed her as nothing more than an object to abuse until they got bored. The forensic evidence that would later be presented in court painted a picture of systematic torture that defies human comprehension. And I need to warn you right now. This next section is going to be difficult. If you need to pause, pause. If you need to step away, step away. There's no shame in protecting your mental health. But if you can hear it, stay with me. Because Shannon's suffering needs to be acknowledged. Her pain needs to be witnessed. That's the least we can do for someone who endured the unendurable. According to prosecutors and medical examiners who testified at trial, Shannon was held captive primarily in the north bedroom of Davidson's house. Vanessa Coleman was assigned to guard her while the men carried out Chris's murder and disposal. Coleman would later claim she was just as much a victim as Shannon, that she was too scared of the men to do anything, that she never participated in the violence. The forensic evidence told a very different story. DNA evidence collected from Shannon's body confirmed she was repeatedly raped by multiple attackers over the course of her captivity. LaTalvis Davidson's sperm was found inside her. Lamarcus Cobbin's DNA was also recovered from her body. The medical examiner described her internal injuries as extreme, far more than a simple sexual assault. These were injuries caused by brutal, prolonged, sadistic violence. But the sexual violence was only part of her suffering. Shannon was beaten repeatedly throughout her captivity. Kicked in the groin with such force that it caused severe internal bruising. Her head sustained multiple blunt force injuries. The medical examiner would later testify that someone had either punched her in the face multiple times or slammed her head against hard surfaces. Carpet burns covered much of her body. Her knees, her elbows, her back. The kind of injuries you get from being dragged across floors. The kind of injuries that tell a story of someone trying to crawl away, trying to escape, being pulled back by her attackers over and over again. Shannon fought. That's important to understand. She didn't just submit. She fought for her life until the very end. During one of the trials, prosecutors displayed photographs of Shannon's body as it was found. A seasoned prosecutor, someone who had seen countless crime scenes, grew faint and had to leave the courtroom. That's how bad it was. That's how brutal her injuries were. Even people trained to handle the worst humanity has to offer couldn't process what had been done to this 21-year-old college student. Now I'm going to tell you something that makes this even worse. While Shannon was being tortured, while she was being raped and beaten, she was forced to remain quiet. Vanessa Coleman, the 18-year-old girl who later claimed to be an innocent bystander, was in that bedroom guarding her. Making sure she didn't scream. Making sure she didn't try to escape. Making sure the men could take turns abusing her without interruption. Let that sink in. A woman, barely an adult, participated in the torture of another woman. Stood guard while men brutalized someone who could have been her friend, her classmate, her sister. Drop a comment telling me what you think should happen to someone like Vanessa Coleman. Because the question of her guilt would become one of the most controversial aspects of this entire case. Sunday passed in a haze of pain for Shannon. Hour after hour of torture broken up by periods of being left alone in that bedroom, bound and helpless, wondering if each minute would be her last. According to the timeline established at trial, the men left the house several times during Sunday. They went out driving around in Shannon's 4Runner, using it like they owned it. They went to buy food. They went to visit friends. And each time they left, they knew they had a dying woman locked in their bedroom. They knew Christopher Newsom's burned body was lying on railroad tracks less than half a mile away. And they didn't care. At some point on Sunday, Davidson was seen by witnesses wearing Christopher's Nike shoes. Size 9.5. The same shoes Chris had been wearing when he was forced to walk barefoot to his execution. Davidson walked around Knoxville in a dead man's shoes like it was nothing. Like he just found them at a thrift store. He also used Chris's cell phone. Called people. Sent texts. Pretended to be Chris in some messages, trying to buy time before anyone realized what had happened. Shannon's personal belongings, her purse, her camera, her clothing, Davidson gave these to his girlfriend as gifts. To him, Shannon Christian wasn't a human being. She was a source of entertainment and profit. Something to be used and discarded. Sunday afternoon came and went. Sunday evening arrived. And at some point during those hours, Shannon's attackers made a calculated decision. They needed to destroy DNA evidence. They needed to make sure that even if her body was found, investigators wouldn't be able to definitively prove who had raped her. So they poured bleach down her throat. I need you to understand what that means. Bleach is a chemical that burns on contact. It causes severe damage to mucous membranes, to the esophagus, to the stomach lining. Imagine the pain of that burning traveling from your mouth down your throat into your chest. Imagine not being able to scream because your throat is swelling shut. Imagine knowing your attackers are doing this specifically to erase evidence of what they've done to you. The medical examiner found chemical burns in Shannon's mouth and throat during her autopsy. She also found bleach in Shannon's stomach. That means Shannon swallowed it. Whether voluntarily to try to end her suffering faster, or because she was forced to, we'll never know. But we know bleach entered her body while she was still alive. After pouring bleach down her throat, they scrubbed her body with cleaning chemicals. They paid particular attention to areas where the men had left biological evidence. They were trying to erase themselves from her body, trying to make sure science couldn't connect them to their crimes. But they made a mistake. Because no matter how much you clean, you can't erase everything. DNA has a way of surviving. And years later, in a laboratory, scientists would find traces of Davidson and Cobbins exactly where the evidence said they would be. Monday, January 8, 2007. Hour 48 of Shannon Christian's captivity. She had survived longer than anyone thought possible. Longer than her attackers expected. And that became a problem for them. Because the longer she stayed alive, the longer she remained a witness. The longer she could potentially escape or be found. The longer she represented a threat to their freedom. So they made their final decision. Around midday Monday, according to the medical examiner's testimony, Shannon was still alive but barely conscious. The bleach, the beatings, the sexual assaults, the chemical burns, everything had taken its toll. She was dying but not fast enough for her killers. They bound her in what investigators later described as a hogtied position using curtains and strips of bedding. Her arms were pulled behind her back. Her legs were bent upward. Everything was tied together so tightly that she couldn't move, couldn't straighten out, could barely breathe. Then they covered her face with a small plastic bag. Not large enough to suffocate her immediately, but enough to restrict airflow, to make every breath a struggle. They stuffed her body into multiple large black trash bags. The kind you use for yard waste. Heavy-duty plastic that wouldn't tear easily. They forced her broken body into a residential garbage can in Davidson's kitchen. The kind with a lid that seals. Then they covered her with sheets and other debris. And they left her there. The medical examiner was very clear about what happened next. Shannon Christian slowly suffocated to death inside that garbage can. She was conscious when they put her in there. She was aware of what was happening. She knew she was being buried alive in trash. The medical examiner estimated she survived between 1 and 4 hours after being placed in the garbage can. 1 to 4 hours of slowly running out of oxygen. 1 to 4 hours of darkness and pain and terror. 1 to 4 hours of knowing you're dying and being unable to do anything about it. Her hands were bound. Her face was covered. Her body was compressed inside plastic bags inside a garbage can with a sealed lid. Every breath pulled in less oxygen than the last. Every second brought her closer to unconsciousness and death. And through it all, she was alone. Her parents didn't know where she was. Her friends didn't know what had happened. Christopher was already dead and couldn't help her. She was utterly, completely alone in the worst moment any human being can experience. If you're crying right now, that's okay. If you're angry, that's okay too. Hit the subscribe button if you think Shannon's story deserves to be told. Because this is exactly the kind of case that people want to forget, want to ignore because it's too painful. But we can't forget. We owe her more than that. The medical examiner testified that Shannon's cause of death was asphyxiation due to being bound and placed in a trash receptacle. But there were multiple contributing factors. The bleach poisoning, the blunt force trauma to her head, the internal injuries from the sexual assaults, all of it combined to slowly kill a 21-year-old woman who had everything to live for. When investigators eventually found her body 3 days later, she was still in that garbage can. Still bound. Still wrapped in trash bags. The medical examiner had to carefully remove layer after layer of binding to even see what had been done to her. During the autopsy, they documented every injury. Every burn. Every bruise. Every broken bone. Every sign of torture. The photographs from that autopsy were so disturbing that multiple people involved in the trials had to leave the courtroom when they were displayed. Seasoned homicide detectives who had worked hundreds of murder cases testified that this was the worst they had ever seen. Not the most violent crime scene, but the most prolonged, most calculated, most deliberately cruel. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't someone who lost control in a moment of rage. This was systematic torture carried out over 48 hours by 5 people who had multiple opportunities to stop and chose not to. 5 people who could have shown mercy at any point and decided their entertainment was more important than another person's life. Let me tell you what Shannon Christian's last thoughts might have been. Maybe she thought about her parents, about how much she loved them and how sorry she was that she wouldn't be coming home. Maybe she thought about Christopher, hoping he had died quickly and wasn't suffering like she was. Maybe she thought about her sociology degree, about the community she had wanted to help, about all the good she had planned to do in the world. Maybe she prayed. Maybe she just wanted it to end. We'll never know what went through her mind in those final hours. But we know this. Shannon Gale Christian was a real person with dreams and plans and people who loved her. And 5 monsters took all of that away for no reason other than their own twisted pleasure. While Shannon was dying on Monday, January 8th, her parents were losing their minds with worry. Gary and Deanna Christian had been calling hospitals, police stations, anyone who might have information. They had organized search parties. They had created missing person flyers. They had done everything humanly possible to find their daughter. And the entire time she was 3 miles away, dying slowly in a killer's kitchen. Christopher's parents, Hugh and Mary Newsom, were in the same situation. Their son hadn't come home. His phone was dead. Nobody had seen him since Saturday night. They knew something was terribly wrong. But nobody knew just how wrong until Sunday afternoon when a railroad worker named William Powell was doing his routine inspection of the tracks behind Chipman Street. That's when he saw it. A body. Burned beyond recognition. Wrapped in a comforter like someone had tried to keep it warm. But this body was charred, blackened, barely human-looking. Powell immediately called police. Detectives arrived and began processing what was obviously a homicide. The victim was male based on body structure. His hands were bound behind his back with shoelaces. His feet were bare despite the freezing temperatures. There was a sock shoved into what remained of his mouth. A sweatshirt had been tied around his neck and head. And most disturbing, the entire body had been set on fire. The medical examiner arrived and conducted a preliminary examination at the scene. 3 bullet wounds were visible. Neck, back and head. This was an execution followed by an attempt to destroy evidence. But who was the victim? The body was too badly burned for visual identification. They would need dental records. They would need to wait for someone to report a missing person matching this description. That report came later that same day. The Newsom family had filed a missing person report for Christopher. When detectives compared the body's dental records to Chris's dental records, they got a match. Christopher Newsom had been found. Now investigators had 1 victim and 0 leads. They had no idea this was connected to another missing person, Shannon Christian. They had no idea there was a second victim who was still alive and dying slowly just half a mile away. Monday, January 8th, passed with forensic teams processing the railroad track crime scene. 3 bullet wounds were visible. Neck, back and head. This was an execution followed by an attempt to destroy evidence. But who was the victim? The body was too badly burned for visual identification. They would need dental records. They would need to wait for someone to report a missing person matching this description. That report came later that same day. The Newsom family had filed a missing person report for Christopher. When detectives compared the body's dental records to Chris's dental records, they got a match. Christopher Newsom had been found. Now investigators had 1 victim and 0 leads. They had no idea this was connected to another missing person, Shannon Christian. They had no idea there was a second victim who was still alive and dying slowly just half a mile away. Monday, January 8th, passed with forensic teams processing the railroad track crime scene. They collected shell casings, photographed everything, documented every detail. But they still didn't know who had killed Christopher Newsom or why. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Gary and Deanna Christian were distributing missing person flyers for their daughter. They were calling her cell phone over and over, hoping she would pick up, hoping there was some innocent explanation for her disappearance. Her phone went straight to voicemail every time. Friends were organizing more search parties. Everyone who knew Shannon was looking for her. And late Monday night they got a break. Shannon's cell phone records showed her last known location pinging from a cell tower on Cherry Street in North Knoxville. That gave them a search area. Monday night into early Tuesday morning, January 9th, family and friends combed Cherry Street and the surrounding neighborhoods. They were looking for Shannon's distinctive Toyota 4Runner. They were looking for any sign of her. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday, January 9th, they found the 4Runner. It was parked at the intersection of Chipman Street and Glider Avenue. Less than 2 blocks from 2316 Chipman Street. Less than half a mile from where Christopher's body had been found on the railroad tracks. The vehicle immediately told a story of violence. The front seats had been pushed all the way back. Shannon was 5'2". There was no way she could reach the pedals with the seat in that position. Someone much taller had been driving her car. The floorboards were covered in mud. Shannon was meticulous about her vehicle. She never would have left it like this. Stickers that Shannon kept on her windows had been peeled off. Personal items she always kept in the car were missing. Her teddy bear, her photographs, her phone charger, all gone. But investigators found something that didn't belong. A pack of Newport cigarettes on the dashboard. Neither Shannon nor Chris smoked. And neither of them smoked Newports. Someone else had been in this car. Someone who smoked Newports. Someone who had left evidence behind. The vehicle was immediately impounded and processed by forensic teams. They dusted for fingerprints, collected DNA samples, documented everything. And that's when they found the envelope. Just a regular envelope inside the vehicle. But on that envelope was a fingerprint. A clear, identifiable fingerprint that didn't belong to Shannon or Christopher. Investigators ran the print through their database and got a hit. The fingerprint belonged to Latalvis Darnell Davidson, a convicted felon with an address at 2316 Chipman Street. Just 2 blocks from where the abandoned 4Runner had been found. Just half a mile from where Christopher Newsome's burned body had been discovered. Suddenly all the pieces started coming together. Davidson's house became the focus of the investigation. On Tuesday, January 9th, detectives obtained a search warrant for 2316 Chipman Street. Multiple units prepared to execute the warrant. SWAT teams were placed on standby in case the suspects were still inside and armed. Everyone involved in the operation knew this case had just become connected to Christopher Newsome's murder. What they didn't know was that they were about to discover a second victim. When officers arrived at Davidson's house on Tuesday morning, they found it empty. The suspects had fled. But the evidence they left behind told a horrifying story. Investigators entered the house cautiously, clearing room by room. The place was a mess. Trash everywhere, dirty dishes, signs of drug use. A typical trap house. But as they moved through the kitchen, something caught their attention. A garbage can. A residential garbage can with the lid sealed. It was covered with sheets. One of the officers lifted the sheets and opened the lid. That's when they found her. Shannon Christian. Stuffed inside multiple trash bags. Her body bound in a hog-tied position. Her face covered with a plastic bag. She had been dead for hours, possibly since the previous afternoon. The officers who made that discovery would later say it was the worst thing they had ever seen in their careers. And these were experienced homicide investigators who had worked countless death scenes. The medical examiner was called immediately. The entire house was declared a crime scene. Forensic teams spent the next several days processing every inch of that property. What they found painted a picture of pure evil. DNA evidence was overwhelming. Davidson's sperm was found inside Shannon's body. Cobbin's DNA was also recovered. Davidson's fingerprints were on the garbage bags that contained her remains. Shell casings found inside the house matched the bullets that had killed Christopher Newsome at the railroad tracks. The murder weapon had been fired inside this house before being taken to the railroad tracks for Chris's execution. Items belonging to both victims were scattered throughout the house. Shannon's purse, her camera with photographs that had been ripped up and some burned, Christopher's baseball caps, his driver's license, his cell phone. The killers had kept trophies of their crimes like this was a game. Investigators found bleach bottles and cleaning supplies that had clearly been used recently. They found blood evidence that had been cleaned but not completely removed. Luminol testing revealed blood spatter in multiple rooms. In the north bedroom where Shannon had been held captive, forensic teams found biological evidence confirming she had been sexually assaulted there multiple times. They found carpet fibers that matched fibers found on her body. They found hairs that matched both victims. The case was becoming airtight from an evidence standpoint. But there was one major problem. All 5 suspects were gone. Latalvis Davidson, Lamarcus Cobbins, George Thomas, Eric Boyd, and Vanessa Coleman had fled. They knew police were looking for them. They knew they had left evidence behind. And they were running. The Knox County Sheriff's Office issued bolos for all 5 suspects. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation joined the manhunt. The FBI offered assistance given the severity of the crimes. Every law enforcement agency in the region was looking for these 5 people. The break came on Thursday, January 11th. Detectives traced phone calls between Davidson and Eric Boyd. Boyd was the weak link in the group. He had been nervous since the murders, talking about turning himself in, worried about the death penalty. Under pressure from investigators, Boyd agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He led police to Davidson's hiding place, a vacant house on Reynolds Street. When police stormed the location on January 11th, they found Latalvis Davidson hiding inside. And with him were 2 critical pieces of evidence. Christopher Newsome's Nike shoes, size 9.5. The same shoes Chris had been wearing Saturday night. The same shoes he'd been forced to remove before his barefoot march to execution. And a .22 caliber revolver. The murder weapon. Ballistics testing would later confirm this was the gun used to shoot Christopher 3 times. Davidson was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of rape, kidnapping, and robbery. Over the next several days, the remaining suspects fell like dominoes. Lamarcus Cobbins and George Thomas were arrested in Lebanon, Kentucky on January 12. Police found them at a motel, monitoring news coverage of the murders on a laptop. They had been watching the investigation unfold, trying to figure out if police were close to catching them. When officers burst into that motel room, Cobbins and Thomas didn't even resist. They knew it was over. Vanessa Coleman was arrested at the same location. Police recovered Shannon's overnight bag and other personal belongings that the killers had taken as souvenirs. Eric Boyd was already in federal custody for his cooperation. He thought his deal would keep him out of prison for the murders. He was wrong, but it would take 12 years to prove it. By mid-January 2007, all 5 suspects were in custody. The Christian and Newsome families finally had answers about what happened to their children. And those answers were worse than anything they could have imagined. If you're still with me at this point, thank you. Thank you for witnessing Shannon and Chris's story. Thank you for not turning away when it got difficult. Leave a comment right now telling me you're still here. Because that matters. You being here matters. The investigation continued for months. Forensic teams processed thousands of pieces of evidence. The medical examiner wrote detailed reports on both victims' injuries. Prosecutors began building their cases against all 5 defendants. And 2 families tried to figure out how to keep living in a world where their children had been tortured to death. The trials would begin in 2008. And what those families would endure over the next 12 years would test the limits of human endurance almost as much as what Shannon and Chris endured in that house. Gary Christian speaks at churches about forgiveness and healing. Not forgiving the killers, he's clear about that, but forgiving himself for the years of rage that nearly destroyed him. Deanna finds peace in their foundation's work, knowing Shannon's dream of helping others continues. Mary Newsome says she sees cardinals and butterflies everywhere, signs she believes that Chris is still with her. 18 years later, 2 young people who had their futures stolen have become something their killers never intended. Guardians of justice. Their names now protect victims across Tennessee. Their memories fund dreams for students who might otherwise never get the chance. Evil tried to erase them. Instead, their legacy grows stronger every year. Thank you for following Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsome's story to the end. If this case moved you, hit that subscribe button right now because we have more stories that deserve to be heard. Stories of victims who became heroes. Stories of families who refused to give up. Stories that need to be remembered. Drop a like on this video if their story touched you. And in the comments, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of their story affected you most? Do you think the justice system needs more reforms to protect victims' families? Shannon wanted to change the world by helping people. Chris wanted to build things that would last. In death, they accomplished both. Their names are written into Tennessee law. Their foundations change lives every year. And every person who hears their story and remembers their names ensures that what happened to them will never be forgotten. That's how we honor victims. Not by dwelling on how they died, but by celebrating how they lived and ensuring their deaths create meaning. Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsome. Say their names. Remember their story. And make sure it never happens to anyone else.